Welcome to the Stories Are Soul Food podcast with your hosts, Brian Kohl and best-selling author, N.D. Wilson. This audio is brought to you by Cannonball Books and Great Homeschool Conventions.
You all just missed the best line I've ever said because it wasn't recorded.
It was just the welcome, don't worry.
Welcome to Stories Are Soul Food. Welcome.
The most hideous episode to date.
Yes, the hideousest. That's a good sound. Hideousest. The most hideous of all of our episodes to date. Today we discuss that hideous strength. Our episodes about the Space Trilogy have not dropped yet.
No, they haven't. We are dropping next week.
We're ahead of schedule. So right now we are doing our final episode on C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy without having gotten any feedback from listeners. So that's kind of fun.
But next week.
It means we can't answer questions yet, and we can't, know where we hurt feelings or whatever. Or when you said things about how Paralander's not a good novel. Stuff like that,
Oh, it feels weird talking to the future, the past.
We're talking to the past from the future. We're talking to the future from the past? Yes.
Yeah, that's it. I find it fun to begin with the negative reviews on Amazon to see what the... This may be an exercise in dumpster diving, but I think it's also fun because occasionally there's a Yelp that shows that C.S. Lewis did exactly what he was doing. One of my favorite negative Amazon reviews was someone who's complaining about his view of women's roles.
Okay.
Except she spelled it ROLLS's. Women's roles. and
he did not have a high view of female baking.
Yeah. Anyways, and she figured that C.S. Lewis was being far too patronizing with Jane and accused the name of Jane as being, and I thought that would be a good intro because Jane is the new main character of this novel.
Is she?
Yes. The protagonist, I should say. Perhaps not the most important character.
Yeah, I would say she is a protagonist.
Mark and Jane, right?
Yeah, she's not the protagonist, but she is a protagonist, and she's a great one. She's a great protagonist.
I thought for all the condescension, this woman missed the fact that C.S. Lewis put his own career as Jane's career, like the English professor. Yep. Jane is the one who's doing what C.S. Lewis.
He actually relates to both Mark and Jane very, very closely. I mean, they're autobiographical in nature for both of them. Their particular drives, their flaws, the ache, the hole inside them both is something that he knew personally and was very, very familiar with.
Can you describe that a bit about Jane?
Yeah. So Jane is looking to matter.
Yeah.
She's looking to matter. She just wants to matter. That's whatever I'm doing. Why am I so despondent? Why am I so empty? Why can't I matter? And she happens to blame the not mattering on and her malaise on her husband, Mark, and kind of really more the relationship of marriage itself. She's kind of blaming it on marriage. She got married and now she's given up her dissertation undone. She's just feeling like the things that used to make her think she mattered or the things that she used to respect about herself no longer exist. And that is something that's pretty common, actually, in high achieving people with any change of life. When they've gotten to a place where they have a lot of self-respect, rightly or wrongly, and then things change. Life changes, and they have to reassess their identity and what makes them actually matter. So, does she matter as Mark Studdock's wife? And she decides, no, she does not. She doesn't matter anymore, and she doesn't matter.
It's that simple that she chose to say, no, I don't matter.
I don't matter anymore.
Right.
And for Mark is trying to matter as well, but he's trying to matter climbing the greasy pole of inclusion and promotion at a college and in the college faculty.
And nonstop committee meetings.
Yeah. And just trying to penetrate the inner circle. Like, can he get into the ring of rings? Can he get into the bullseye of decision makers and the people who matter, the influencers?
So again, a same thing.
He's trying to matter. He's trying to matter. And where they get that mattering is, in Jane's case, in self-perception and how she views her role and what she tries to fulfill. And in Mark's case, is the perception of his peers.
Right.
It's like he doesn't care if he doesn't care if he knows he's a fraud. So Jane cares about that.
Right. She wants to know in her heart.
Yeah, she wants to know that she's not a fraud. When Jane's there by herself, she's committed to wanting to not be a fraud, wanting to matter. And that's, of course, she's deceived in how she's going about assessing that, but that's still her commitment is honest. She has an honest commitment to wanting to matter, and Mark has a dishonest commitment to wanting to matter.
Right. How many times is Mark described as not saying something because he's afraid of how it will sound?
Right. And so Mark is deciding to not matter in order to be welcomed in and not causing friction. He's just being kosher. He's being as kosher as he possibly can for whatever is the in think at his college from the decision maker. So he can kind of, sidle into the inner ring, and he wants to go further and further and further into the inner ring. And he wants to do so while knowing he's a fraud. Right. He doesn't care if he knows he's a fraud. He wants, above all else, other people to not think he is.
Yeah.
And so it's a duality there that's really, I find interesting.
Yeah.
And I think Lewis, in his own reflections in God in the Dock, he writes, I think it's God in the Dock, where he writes an essay on the inner ring and that drive, that just hunger to get further and further inside the club, to be absorbed all the way into the very, very heart of a thing. Then it's really funny because Jane is welcomed right into the most inner ring of all time.
Yeah, Merlin.
So Jane is welcomed into Logris, and she knows the Pendragon, and like she's in the company at St. Anne's. She's welcomed into like the most inner ring you could possibly get into.
The coolest English story there
in
is.
England. Yeah. She just slides right in, and she slides right in there by visiting a therapist, like where she's concerned about, her self-worth and who she is and what she's squandering. And Mrs. Dimble, this very maternal, glorious character, hooks Jane up with this therapist who's very hard and brittle and like puritanical, but turns out to be the gatekeeper for this extremely warm, joyous, jovial company. And so Jane's welcomed into the most incredible inner ring of all time.
Yeah, the company.
Mark is kept away from it. And it's a weird thing that Lewis does there, because for Mark, the giant temptation is the inner ring. Mark would have been gleeful. Like he would have been overwhelmed and gleeful to be welcomed into a secret society, an inner ring.
He might even have dropped nice right away if that.
Yeah, exactly. He would have been just overjoyed to be there,
for the wrong reason.
Yeah. So he had to go. Mark has this long journey of getting further and further in and discovering the fraud of all of it. That those people that he's been receiving his worth from, his value from, are all fraudulent. It's all hypocritical. It's immoral. It goes from like amoral to immoral. And then at the very, very heart of it, it's just demonic. Like at the very heart of all the inner rings, he finds Satan. It's like he's like, it's like he gets all the way there, and that's his trip. And then there's the recoil. So he's recalibrated completely by the time he's welcomed into the true inner ring, which Jane has already just been in the whole time. So Jane is in there immediately and has to process self-worth, self-perception, and hierarchy. And she's learning all of these lessons.
Yeah. Because basically, Jane has decided that Mark doesn't matter, right?
Right.
She says, the certain hierarchy that I've put myself in by being married to this man, I have taken myself out of the game.
Yep, she's taken herself out. She thinks that the institution of marriage is like her doubts are there. So she blames Mark, but Mark's oppression of her is not actual oppression, and she doesn't think he's oppressive. It's just he's boring, and
he's obsessed with things that don't matter.
Yeah, and he's boring, and there's a hierarchical relationship that she thinks is just like destroyed who she is, her identity. But there's these fantastic lessons, these little throwaways that Lewis throws in there for Jane and her arc, like putting on these amazing gowns. She's in the attic of this house, and they're pulling out these historical gowns, these period gowns, these incredibly, for the ancient kings and queens for this event. And she's trying on gowns. I think it's Mrs. Dimble who's there with her. It might be.
I think so.
I think it's Mrs. Dimble.
Yeah.
Maybe somebody can correct us eventually, or I'll go double check. But she's in the attics of St. Anne's, this gorgeous house, trying out these amazing gowns. And she's looking around and realizes there are no mirrors. And she has to gauge whether or not something suits her or is beautiful based on just purely the perception of others. And so she has to put something on, and the others tell her, like, no, this one. And they help her pick and say, this is for you, and this beautifies you, but your beauty exists for others, not for yourself. Like, we are helping you like become beautiful for this event so that we can take pleasure in your beauty. And you can't. You don't even get to see yourself.
No Instagram filter.
And so it's the exact opposite of Mark's problem. Mark's obsessed with the perception of others, and Jane is hung up on her own reflection. And so he does this, the two sides of self-worth, you know, people who are in this, you know, this selfish trap, and people who are in this peer pressure trap.
Gerardian, we may call it. Yeah.
Mimetic. So Mark is entirely mimetic, and Jane is entirely introspective and selfish. And so you have those two characters go on separate journeys that are tailored for them and their own insecurities and their own issues, and then arrive together at St. Anne's when they finally both have matured sufficiently.
I think you've just addressed the big complaint that most of the negative reviews have, which is that those first 8 chapters don't have the same instant I'm in a different world that the first 2 books of the Space Trilogy had. And so people reading this are saying, well, where's the aliens in chapters 1 through 8?
Right.
And it just is not understanding the extreme insight that Lewis has when it comes to the 2 new characters that he's introduced into this scene.
Yeah, but that's also just a fundamental misunderstanding of his project, which is, I'm going to write a story on Mars, I'm going to write a story on Venus, and I'm going to write a story on Earth, because Earth is also a planet.
Yep.
Like it's
right.
It's also a planet, and we are the aliens.
Yeah.
On this planet. Like we are the ones who live here. And so to complain that there aren't aliens, it's like, well, there are.
We're just comfortable with them.
Yeah, just we happen to be them. So he's roaming through the solar system, writing about the inhabitants of different planets, and arrives on ours. And okay, you know, from the first book to the last book, the foreshadowing's there out of the silent planet, and then that hideous strength ends with into the silent planet. You know, it's like we're in the silent planet. The story happens in the silent planet, and Malacandra and whatever her name is, Paralandra, descend into the silent planet,
and the silent planet is made silent no more.
Yep. And so it's, if they look at that and they say, why aren't we on Jupiter? It's like, well, that's not the project. You might complain about it, but the project itself was to go out from Earth and come back to Earth with a new perception. So they're just missing it if they're complaining that there's no aliens or there's no sci-fi fast enough.
It's quite a bit different than the first 2, though, right? Writing style wise, I think.
Yeah, because it is.
Yeah, it's much more of that character sketch. Where
it's much better.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just
totally by every metric
significantly better. And that's not to slight the earlier ones. It's just to say this is phenomenal.
This is a novel. This is what literature is supposed to do.
Yeah. And I have said many times that Hideous Strength is my favorite novel in the English language. And that is in fact the case.
Yeah.
I mean, it remains there. It sits there. It has not been dethroned. And I've read some great stuff, and nope, none of it touches what Lewis accomplished in this book.
Should we talk about title? It seems like the title's significant there. It comes from that poem from the 1600s, right? Where it's describing
classic Lewis title.
Yeah. A grab from his career, right? From his academic career. Yeah. He snatched, I can't remember the exact line, but describing the Tower of Babel, and describes that hideous strength spelled in very old 15th century English or 1500s English. I don't remember. My centuries are off.
16th century, I believe.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, that hideous strength around the story of Babel.
Right.
And most people don't even notice that this is the story of Babel until they get to the chapter called like the Tower of Babel. It's like, or just Babel. I don't remember what he calls the chapter.
Right. Where all of a sudden everybody stops
the curse
able
to
understand each other.
The Curse of Babel actually is used in the story, and people say, "Oh wow, a Babel reference."
Yeah.
It's like, oh, that's been keyed up from the beginning.
What is Babel in the Hideous Strength? That's the scientism we've been talking about,
yeah,
right?
the NICE. So the NICE, the quest for domination and really the quest for domination and immortality pursued through materialism, scientism.
Yeah, straight out of Genesis, we'll make a name for ourselves on the earth.
Yep. And it starts with hyper-materialism and power, and descends into devil worship.
Right.
And sheer devilry.
Yeah.
So when men go on a quest for immortality apart from the blood of Christ, like apart from the resurrection, they inevitably will partner up with devils. You can't. Like if you're a material being with a soul and you're trying to find out how to permanently bond your soul to your flesh, how to permanently maintain consciousness here and bypass death, in the end, you're always going to talk to a demon. Like it just,
right.
You're going to go up and up and up. You're going to go through all the, the researchers and the genetic modifications and everything else. And you might try it. You try all of it materialistically, but you're dealing with one half of you, the material flesh, your body. So you cannot come up with a hack for keeping the soul in the body without addressing the spiritual side and a spiritual hack. You have to come up with a physical hack and a spiritual hack. And so there's this quest for physical hacks that will, in the end, reach you, get you to a place where you say, so is Ashtoreth around? Could I talk to her? How about Dagon or Baal?
Right.
It's like, I need a demon.
Card carrying Satanists will tell you that Satanism is about the worship of self. But I think that's a lie.
Right. They're fake ones. Those are just the Church of Satan is a joke and
right.
Invented to shock suburban mothers in the US at least. Anton LaVey.
Yeah.
But it's real devil worship, real devilry is a lot more terrifying than anything they do.
Right. And then I think one other, I thought that the head transplant stuff was Lewis doing sci-fi, but of course that's actually, I found out, extremely real. Being that this may tell you more about me than you want to know, but I'm reading a book called Stiff about cadavers, right, by Mary Roach. And she has a whole chapter on head transplants, which we have been trying to do. And I say the human race, the members of the Silent Planet have been trying to do head transplants at least from the time of the French Revolution, where all these French scientists
had a whole bunch of available heads.
Had a bunch of heads. Tried to get it working by, they recognized that a human consciousness lasts for a good 10 or 12 seconds after beheading. And then, of course, going all the way through up until the 70s, we had he's a Catholic doctor swapped heads on monkeys and kept them alive for a certain amount of time. And he says, for sure, I could do it on humans. They're ready for me to do it in the Dominican Republic. They're ready. They'll pay. There's just not enough money in it right now and too much liability. And then he says the Pope disapproves.
Yeah, I don't know why he thinks there'd be any liability involved. But more than that, you can have your head frozen. So we've had that for a long time, where you can, when you die, you can pay a lot of money. Your family can pay a lot of money to have you cryogenically frozen, or just your head.
Oh, right, because that prevents the tissue loss that leads to brain death. And
so, yeah, it's just kind of like, well, we'll save your head. You might be dead. We'll cut off your body and save your head for transplant later, when we figured out how to do it. So we'll bring you back. But
we will pay now.
Yeah, pay now. Pay your $500,000 now. And then we'll stick you in a chamber of liquid nitrogen. And actually, I watched one of these things happen.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I wasn't present, but I watched footage of it. And at least in this particular incident, I was really astounded at how they just were sticking people in sleeping bags and duct taping it heavily. And like, it was like the inner liner. And you end up like, that's our embalmment. Like at least the Egyptians knew there should be some more ritual to it, some liturgy. Like, we're going to put your organs in a jar and then we're going to stick you over here and eventually you'll come back.
Right.
When we figured it out. But this case, we have a lot of like REI sleeping bags getting dipped in liquid nitrogen. So it's comical. It's God telling that hideous strength story. So we've been obsessed with immortality, and as a result of that obsession with immortality, head transplants for some time, because we thought, well, if the body is sick, if death is entering below the neck, then we can just we can kill some lower class person and swap you on, right?
Right.
That's been a fantasy for a long, long time.
Mm.
And it's it's still present. Like it still is. Elon Musk right now is very, very interested not in relocating the head, but in relocating consciousness. He wants to be able to isolate and remove human consciousness and place it in a synthetic life form.
Whew.
So his goal is to send synthetic life forms inhabited by human consciousness into space. It belongs in this exact trilogy. Like, okay, I'm going to kill you, have you haunt a machine, and then launch you into space. I mean, that's kind of...
Can you imagine?
What a bummer. How horrible would that be?
The worst afterlife ever.
And this is what we call hell.
No kidding.
Anyway, as far as that Hideous Strength goes, what Lewis is doing with head transplants and immortality and the quest for immortality, and revealing that pursuing immortality through scientism results in demonism. It will always, always cross paths with the occult and end up absorbed by it.
Are people overt about that right now? Do you think, or do you think they're being co-opted? Like the way that say, well, I mean, at the end of that Hideous Strength.
I think so. Actually, I think there's some overtness to it. For
Okay.
sure. There are people who are aware of quote unquote powers, influences, things like that. They might not use the same terminology, but absolutely. And we call a whole bunch of them UFOs. Every time we see something we can't identify, it's like, well, we assume it's biological, but we have a ton of footage and things that have been declassified thanks to our previous president. People seeing things flying way too fast for the laws of physics. Navy pilots with footage of things going way beyond friction, like what friction would allow. We know we're kind of witnessing the material effects of immaterial activity. Anyway, there's a lot there, and people are definitely deep diving. The richer they are, the stranger the deep dive is, because they have billions of dollars. What else do they have to do except for try to become immortal, either through reshaping the world or actually hanging out for as long as possible? So anyway, that's a bit of a distraction, but not really. I mean, that's what Lewis is addressing.
It's just Lewis is not writing that aspect. The scientism he's describing is not fictional.
Right.
The people he's describing, the villains that terrify you.
The grossness of the villainy is with us today.
Right.
It's absolutely with us today. And you think about the baby part sales that were exposed. You think about the things we've seen recently that just goes on.
Right.
It just goes on. I had a UFC fighter tell me that a lot of his friends were all about, embryonic stem cell injections.
Yikes.
And, if you think about that, like, what is that? It's like, well, if you just shift genre slightly, you realize this is what we call necromancy. Like, there's names for this.
Power from dead things.
Yeah. It's like, okay.
From bodies.
We're going to we're going to murder a bunch of babies. We're going to blend them into a paste, and we're going to inject it into a fighter to make him strong. Like, that's 100% necromancy. Now, the thing that was bizarre that he told me, he was not a believer, but he told me, I think he's probably a Jack Catholic from way back, that everybody that he knew who was injected with embryonic stem cells in different injuries, like, if you had a jacked up shoulder or something, and you'd be trying to supplement your recovery with something like this. He said everybody he knew who did it was filled with tumors. It's like they all just sprouted tumors, tons of tumors. And his words were, it's like it's cursed.
He said that. He said that.
Yeah. And I'm like, oh, really? Like, it's like God's cheating, basically. So, and he said, then of course, if you use adult stem cells, he's like, scientifically, medically, they shouldn't be as effective. It should not work as well. But if you do use adult stem cells harvested minus the murder, you don't have the tumor effect.
I shouldn't be laughing. Right. That's not really funny, but
no, but it is. It is on a cosmic level. It's like there is a God, and he will judge you, and you are gonna you will reap a harvest.
Yeah, tumors.
Sow the wind, reap the whirlwind. It's like this is just the way God functions. So he was telling me this, like, and as an unbeliever, he was telling me like, oh, I would never. That's just gross. And plus, it's like cursed, man. And told me the stories and was like, oh, and these, of course, are fighters who are flying to Panama or Germany or other places where they can do this legally. You can't do it in the US. So, and then having all the downstream curse consequences. So anyway, we live in this world, and Lewis did too. And that Hideous Strength is not far-fetched. Like, it just really is not.
Yeah.
So
down to the bear.
down to the bear. It's maybe the farthest fetched part is Merlin, but that's also my favorite part. So the use of Merlin, and actually there's Tolkien, we should say,
would have been furious, right?
Hated this book. He said it ruined the trilogy. This
okay.
book.
So he would have been on Amazon with the 1-star review.
Classic Tolkien.
There's a thematic inconsistency.
Yeah, his objection was the kind of myth mixing, the mythology that Lewis felt free to use, and Lewis's use of Arthurian mythology in the third book, when Arthurian mythology had not been present in the first two, he found to be a bridge too far. I found it to be just right. It's perfect.
Is the bridge to the place Nate wanted to go.
Yeah, it absolutely is. So it's what was missing from the first two. This one is fantastic. So Lewis takes the space travel, the medieval cosmology, and if Tolkien had been paying really close attention, he would realize that the medieval cosmology actually does like open the door to pulling in the medieval world, the really early pre-medieval, that the so-called dark ages that were actually quite bright, pull that in to the story. It makes perfect sense that Lewis, using the mythology from the medievals of the planets and the music of the spheres and everything else, that he would pull in other old stories from back then as well. So the mythology around Merlin and Merlin's birth, and specifically the sin of Genesis 6 and the sin of the Old Testament that it eventually, like that grasping for the heavens, that got us to the Tower of Babel again. So Merlin comes in under this Nephilimic mythology.
Right.
And he has Merlin deny it. They said I was a son of a devil, but they lied.
Yeah.
But he pulls him in and uses him brilliantly. I mean, brilliantly. His knowledge historically and anthropologically, sociologically of an old Britain, what an old British character would actually be like.
Yeah. Totally. I learned some good Latin curses from Merlin. I think Mastigia is a good one. Someone basically like a wearer out of whips. Someone has just like been
You're so stupid.
Yeah.
We wear out the whips on you.
Right.
Yeah. So what he does, and Tolkien hated it because of Charles Williams' influence. Charles Williams was big on Arthur, Logris, etc. Lewis said, "Ooh, goody," and found something shiny and wove it in. And so we have the space piece, the landing on Earth. It's like the story's actually all descending here. The theme of Babel, the theme of scientism leading to devilry. Then the individual human character studies around self-worth and also the pursuit of the inner ring, like where that comes from, which ultimately results in a meditation on marriage.
Right.
Hierarchy in marriage.
And the setup is that the silent planet has our own broken versions of all the beautiful things. So we have our own version of Malacandra and Paralandra, right? But ours are, twisted. Yeah.
Mars and Venus are fallen angels.
Yeah.
That they're like the ambassadors. So if you think of like, in Lewis's mythology, you have Venus, the goddess Venus is unfallen. She is a faithful angel, basically. But she's the capital V Venus who rules the planet Venus. She has an ambassadress on Earth. A small V Venus, who is her servant, who fell with Satan, who rebelled against God. And so the Venus worshipped by the ancients was the cheap fallen ambassador from that planet. But there is an angel from that planet who was unfallen and came here in part to set that right.
Yeah.
To help address that. So,
and that's what happens at the end, right? Because the end is weird.
Spoiler.
The end's pretty weird, I think.
We're going to spoil it.
Yeah.
Hey, you all should have already read this. It was assigned, right?
And this won't ruin it for them either.
No, it shouldn't.
Because I think when you head into that, I remember as a high school kid reading it for the first time, I thought, what's happening? I was tracking for plot, not for theme.
Yep.
And that was very surprising.
So Ransom calls in his allies that he's made from other planets.
Yeah.
And they descend to help put an end
to the NICE.
To help put an end to this particular Babel attempt. So they arrive, the unfallen Venus, the unfallen Mars show up visiting from their own spheres to do battle.
Yeah.
That's
how cool is that?
They show up to do battle on behalf of the inner ring that Jane has found and welcomed Mark into. This is.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the big finale, and it all ends up with a bear. doing what a bear should do.
Crushing heads.
Mr. Boltitude, my favorite character of the book. Quite fantastic. So, I mean, as far as the stories go, Lewis is weaving a lot together, but in this one, even far more than the other two, he's weaving in himself, in his own journey, his own sanctification, his own quest that led him to salvation ultimately, and his own discovery of the beauty of hierarchy, the beauty of submission and obedience to a higher authority.
I think one of the strengths of Lewis, again, is that you have such a cosmic story that helps us feel that the everyday life is actually important. That's the takeaway, right? Because it ends with Jane and Mark. You know, the two of them as
marriage.
As part of something.
As part of the dance of the spheres, as part of the music of the entire universe.
Yeah. What an honor for tiny little people. Tiny little aliens on the silent planet.
Yeah, exactly. But he also does such a great job of these little touches, like Ivy Maggs is a character, a faithful wife of a struggling guy. You know, he was doing prison time.
Oh yeah.
And she's helping out in this inner ring, this inner circle, this company at St. Anne's. But her relationship to the bear and her relationship to this other great character of McPhee, you know, the angry, like honest intellectual, but who's not a believer. And, you know, McPhee kind of represents another aspect of Lewis's life and his own journey, and was very much based off a particular person.
Yeah.
But the way Ivy Maggs relates to the crotchety Scotsman and to the bear, he's showing you something he finds to be as beautiful as a thundercloud and as harmonic with it. You know, it's like that these domestic relationships and domestic beauty, like all the way down to the grass and all the way up to the heavens, is when it's all in harmony, is all part of one whole and one whole beautiful dance. So he shows that, and there's these little castaway moments of Ivy relating to the bear and other things like that. And that's not accidental. It's not like, let's throw in some physical comedy. It's, you know, it's profound. It's a deep comment. You see the same thing with Ransom and his relationship to the mice. So,
okay. I vaguely remember that, but not very well.
So Ransom's eating lunch. You know, he's eating lunch, and Jane is there, and she's very overwhelmed by this guy, like Moses coming off of Sinai. He's met with God, basically.
So he's glowing.
He's this kind of overwhelming presence now, and she's being tempted to fall for him, and he knows this immediately and rebukes her, which is whoa. But she doesn't say anything. He sees it, but he eats very simple fare, and there's breadcrumbs, not bread and wine. Breadcrumbs fall because he's eating bread, and then he whistles, and the mice come out, and even the mice are obedient. And the mice come running out. They gather up all his crumbs and then disappear and just run away. It's this little touch, and there's a fantastic description of a mouse making its way through like a shag carpet, through like a really thick carpet. So like just hunting across the floor. And she's kind of all of her normal, like just aversion, all of her normal, how grossed out she'd be by a mouse, by the rodent, by this ancient nemesis of domesticity. It just kind of vanishes as she watches it in harmony, as she watches it submissive and obedient and going back to its place, you know.
Yeah.
Instead of raiding your pantry and leaving its spore, it's showing up and cleaning up and running away.
Yeah.
And vanishing in obedience and coming when called and leaving when told. And it's a very different thing. And it's a funny little scene, and I love it a lot. But it is one of those moments when Lewis is harmonizing the whole thing. Like we're going from rodents, we're going from bears, we're going from bees, we're going from flowers down to the plants, all the way up to the planets and beyond.
That's great. I wonder if we should end there.
We should because it's awesome. Yeah. Merlin is actually my favorite character. Mr. Bultitude's number 2, but I've read this book more times than I can count. And it shows me something every single time.
We didn't get to talk about Fairy Hardcastle. Speaking of least favorite characters.
Yeah, but, speaking of officers who remind me of officers I've dealt with in my life.
Me too.
Alrighty.
Yeah.
Until next time, when we talk about something else, go read That Hideous Strength or listen to it audiobook style.
Next time, N.D. Wilson. I think we're starting on our Odyssey of N.D.'s works, but we need
whatever
Brian
says. Whatever Brian says. Send in any questions you have about my particular stuff, things I could actually answer. And read That Hideous Strength. Yeah. Read it.
Read it to harmonize all together. That's the sign of great literature, if it all speaks to itself.
Perfect. Alrighty. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to this week's edition of the Stories Are Soul Food podcast. I wanted to recommend a book from the Canon Press shelf called What I Learned in Narnia by Douglas Wilson. Alan Jacobs, author of The Narnian, said this about the book. What I Learned in Narnia is a rich response to stories that hold a world of wisdom. Douglas Wilson draws forth that wisdom and shows it to us all. You can find this book at canonpress.com as well as on the Canon app.